There is a moment in the Old Testament so strange, so unsettling, so theologically loaded, that most people either laugh it off as a children's story or skip past it entirely, embarrassed by its absurdity. A donkey opens its mouth and speaks. Not in a dream, not in a vision, in broad daylight, on a dusty road somewhere in the territory of Moab, with a pagan seer sitting on its back. But if you stop there, if you reduce this story to a talking animal, you have missed everything. Because what God did to Balaam on that road was not a miracle meant to entertain. It was a judgment, a humiliation, and one of the most precise theological confrontations in all of Scripture. The question is not simply why the donkey spoke. The question is why God chose this method, this specific, deliberate, almost brutal method, to expose a man who thought he could navigate between the will of God and the wages of a king. To understand what is happening in Numbers 22 through 24, you have to understand who Balaam was, who the people of Israel were at this particular moment in history, and what the nations surrounding Canaan believed about the power of prophetic blessing and cursing. This is not background information. This is the entire architecture of the story. Without it, you are reading a fairy tale. With it, you are reading one of the most layered accounts of divine sovereignty and human spiritual corruption in the entire Hebrew Bible. The Israelites had been wandering in the wilderness for nearly 40 years. They had come out of Egypt, crossed the sea, received the Torah at Sinai, and were now camped in the plains of Moab, just east of the Jordan River. On the edge of the land, God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were an enormous people. The text says that Israel covered the face of the earth, Numbers 22:5, a phrase that deliberately echoes the language of the locusts in the Exodus plagues, which the book of Exodus uses to describe a swarm so vast it blotted out the land, Exodus 10:5. The choice of that language was not accidental. It was a signal to any reader steeped in the Torah. What is coming toward Moab is as unstoppable as the plagues that broke Egypt. And they had just finished defeating two powerful Amorite kings, Sihon and Og, in battle. The nations surrounding them were gripped with fear. Moab, a kingdom descended from Lot, nephew of Abraham, was watching this massive multitude press toward its borders, and the dread was visceral and existential. Numbers 22:3 says that Moab was filled with dread because of the Israelites, and that the anguish was great. Balak, son of Zippor, the king of Moab, looked at what had happened to Sihon and Og and made a cold calculation. A direct military confrontation was not viable, so he reached for a different kind of weapon. In the ancient Near East, the spoken word of a trained seer or diviner was understood to carry real operative power. This was not primitive superstition unique to one culture. It was a shared cosmological assumption across Mesopotamia, Canaan, Egypt, and the entire Semitic world. When a recognized figure of spiritual authority blessed, the blessing was believed to take hold. When he cursed, the curse was believed to take root. The power was understood to flow through the human vessel from a divine or supernatural source, and the practitioner's value lay in his ability to channel it with precision. Balak understood this framework completely. He sent messengers to Balaam, son of Beor, a man from Pethor near the Euphrates River, almost certainly in the region of Aram Naharaim in northern Mesopotamia, who had a documented and widely recognized reputation. The summons was explicit: "Come and curse this people for me, for I know that whoever you bless is blessed, and whoever you curse is cursed." Numbers 22:6. This was not poetic language. Balak was hiring a spiritual weapon. What makes Balaam so theologically fascinating and so theologically dangerous is that he was not simply a pagan practitioner operating in ignorance of the God of Israel. He was a man who had genuine encounter with YHWH, When the Moabite delegation arrived with payment for divination in their hands, the Hebrew text says, Kesamim be'adam, the tools and fees of the divinatory trade. Balaam told them to spend the night while he inquired of the Lord, and the text uses the covenantal personal name, HWH, not merely Elohim. The God of Israel spoke to Balaam. Balaam heard him and responded, "This is not a man ignorant of the living God." He was a seer who had genuine access to divine communication, and that is precisely what makes his story something other than a story about paganism. It is a story about what happens when a person who genuinely knows the truth slowly allows greed and ambition to bend him toward destruction. The New Testament writers understood this with great clarity. Peter warns about those who have followed the way of Balaam, son of Beor, who loved the wages of wickedness. 2 Peter 2:15. Jude speaks of those who have rushed headlong into the error of Balaam for profit. Jude 11. And Jesus himself, in the letter to the church at Pergamum in the book of Revelation, says there are those who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel. Revelation 2:14. Balaam is not a figure the biblical canon treats as a minor curiosity. He is a recurring archetype of spiritual compromise in someone who was genuinely gifted. God told Balaam directly in that first night encounter not to go with the messengers, not to curse the people, for they are blessed. Numbers 22:12. Balaam sent the first delegation away, but Balak did not accept that answer. He sent a second delegation, more distinguished than the first, with a sweeping offer. "I will reward you very handsomely, and I will do whatever you say." And here the fracture begins to show. Balaam's response sounds righteous on the surface. "If Balak were to give me a palace full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the command of the Lord, my God, to do anything less or more." But then he tells the second delegation to stay the night, because he wants to find out whether God will say anything more to him. He already had the answer. God had already said no. What Balaam was doing was not seeking clarity. He was looking for permission. He wanted to go. He wanted the money. He wanted the prestige of being summoned by a king. The second night God gives him conditional permission. "Go with them, but do only what I tell you." Numbers 22:20. And the very next verse says that God's anger was aroused because he went. Numbers 22:22. This is not a contradiction in the text. It is a devastatingly accurate portrait of the human heart. God granting a man the thing the man was determined to pursue, while being grieved by the very desire that drove him to pursue it. This is the moment the angel of the Lord takes his position in the road, with a drawn sword in his hand. This figure is not an escort assigned to guide Balaam safely to Moab. The drawn sword makes his purpose unmistakable. In the Hebrew scriptures, an angel standing with an unsheathed sword is an agent of divine judgment, not a guide. The same posture appears in 1 Chronicles 21:16, when the angel stands over Jerusalem with a sword drawn, and the people fall on their faces in terror. This was an executioner standing between Balaam and his destination. Balaam could not see him, his donkey could. And what happens next is one of the most structurally deliberate passages in the entire Torah. 3 times the donkey sees the angel, and 3 times she takes action to avoid him. The first time, she turns off the road into a field, and Balaam beats her to force her back onto the path. The second time, the angel stands in a narrow passage between 2 vineyard walls, and the donkey presses against the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against it, and Balaam beats her again. The third time, the angel stands in a place so confined there is no room to swerve in either direction, and the donkey simply lies down under Balaam, and Balaam strikes her with his staff for the third time. The threefold repetition is deliberate literary architecture. The Hebrew tradition uses this pattern to build inevitably toward a turning point. 3 occurrences establish a pattern, and the third occurrence breaks it open into revelation. 3 beatings, 3 failures on the part of the seer to perceive what his animal perceived. And then God opened the mouth of the donkey, Numbers 22:28. The Hebrew verb is patach, to open, to make an opening where none existed. It is the same verb used for God opening a womb that was closed, Genesis 29:31, for opening the windows of heaven, Genesis 7:11. God created an opening in the donkey's capacity that was entirely outside her natural design. And the donkey said to Balaam, "What have I done to you, that you have beaten me these 3 times? Stop here for a moment." A man whose entire identity and livelihood rested on being a conduit of divine speech. A man who had held conversations with the God of Israel, who had heard the voice of heaven and relayed its words to kings, is now being spoken to by his own donkey. And he answers her as if the conversation is unremarkable. He's so consumed by frustration and by the drive to reach his destination that he does not stop to register the staggering supernatural quality of what is happening. He argues. He tells the donkey that if he had a sword in his hand, he would kill her right now. And the donkey replies with the question that dismantles everything. "Am I not your donkey, on which you have ridden all your life to this day? Have I ever behaved this way toward you before?" Numbers 22:30. And he has to say no. She had served him faithfully for years. She had never once behaved this way. It was only when a divine executioner was standing in their path that she broke her lifelong pattern. The very faithfulness of the animal became the proof of her perception. She was not acting out of stubbornness or random rebellion. She was responding to something real that her rider could not see. God then opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with his sword drawn, and he bowed his head and fell on his face. Numbers 22:31. The great seer, the man hired for his spiritual sight, collapses before a messenger he could not see until God forced his eyes open. And the angel confronts him directly. "Why have you beaten your donkey these 3 times? I have come out as an adversary, because your way is headlong ruin before me." The Hebrew word in verse 32 is yarat, which carries the sense of rushing recklessly toward destruction, the image of a person barreling down a road that leads to their own end without recognizing it. And the angel then delivers the sentence that should stop every reader cold. "If she had not turned away from me, I would certainly have killed you by now, while letting her live." Numbers 22:33. Let that sentence fully land. God would have killed the prophet and spared the donkey. The animal had more spiritual perception than the man who was being paid to perceive spiritual realities. The beast recognized the holiness and the danger of the divine presence. The professional seer with decades of practice was completely blind to it. This is the humiliation at the core of the story, and this is precisely why God chose this particular method. An angel striking Balaam dead with a sword would have simply ended him. But a donkey with a voice, addressing him in his own language, asking him to account for his own behavior, that accomplished something a sword alone never could. It exposed the radical inversion that greed had produced in Balaam's soul. His animal was seeing more clearly than he was. You cannot be a man whose entire authority rests on spiritual sight and then be outperformed, in that same category, by the animal beneath you. The theology is not subtle. God was not merely warning Balaam. He was dismantling the foundation of Balaam's self-understanding. The rabbinical tradition has always paid extraordinary attention to this passage. The Mishnah in Tractat Avot 5.6 lists the mouth of Balaam's donkey among 10 things created at twilight on the eve of the first Sabbath, wonders built into the structure of creation itself, set aside for their appointed moment in history. This is a profound statement. It means the rabbis understood that the donkey's speech was not an improvisation. It was a prepared instrument, woven into the fabric of creation from the very beginning, waiting across all of history for this one road, this one prophet, this one moment of divine confrontation. God did not scramble to find a way to stop Balaam. He had prepared the answer before Balaam's greed was ever born. The rabbinic midrashic literature also notes that the Hebrew word used throughout the passage for the donkey is aton, specifically the female donkey, and some traditions understood this animal to have been set apart. Early Christian interpreters and some Jewish traditions connected her symbolically to the donkey that would carry the Messiah into Jerusalem, Zechariah 9:9, fulfilled in Matthew 21:1-7. An interpretive thread that is midrashic rather than directly stated in the biblical text, but carries significant weight in the history of interpretation. The symbolic resonance is undeniable, whether or not one presses the literal connection. The creature that bore the seer who sought to destroy God's people becomes, in the tapestry of the whole Bible, connected to the creature that bore the one who came to redeem them. The animal that exposed spiritual blindness in the wilderness is linked to the one of whom Isaiah wrote, "I will lead the blind by a way they did not know," Isaiah 42:16. When Balaam finally reaches Balak and is brought to look out over the camp of Israel spread across the valley, something that neither man expected happens repeatedly. Balak brought Balaam first to Bamoth Baal, Numbers 22:41. Then to the field of Zophim on the summit of Pisgah, Numbers 23:14. Then to the top of Peor overlooking the wasteland, Numbers 23:28. Each time Balak tried a different vantage point, apparently working under the assumption that geography might produce a different prophetic result, that cursing Israel from a different angle might give Balaam's words a better trajectory toward their target. And each time, Balaam opened his mouth to curse, and blessings poured out instead. 4 oracles in total, Numbers 23:24, each one more expansive than the one before. The third oracle includes the famous line, "How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel," Numbers 24:5. Words so beautiful that they became part of the permanent morning liturgy of the Jewish people, recited to this day every time a Jewish community gathers for prayer. The fourth oracle closes with one of the most astonishing Messianic declarations in the entire Hebrew Bible. "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth from Jacob, a scepter shall rise from Israel." Numbers 24:17. This passage was interpreted in the Second Temple period as referring to a coming royal Messiah. The community at Qumran applied it in the Damascus document. Early Christians connected it to Jesus. A seer hired to curse Israel delivered a prophecy about Israel's coming king. The irony of divine sovereignty cannot be stated more clearly than this. But the story of Balaam does not end with the oracles. He could not curse Israel with his mouth. The Spirit of God controlled what came out. But Balaam found a different road to the same destination. Numbers 31:16 tells us explicitly that it was through the counsel of Balaam that the women of Midian caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the matter of Peor. Balaam could not defeat Israel from the outside, so he advised Balak to send women who would draw Israelite men into sexual immorality and the worship of Baal of Peor. If the sword of cursing was denied to him, he would use a different weapon, seduction and idolatry. The strategy produced catastrophic results within Israel. A plague killed 24,000 people, Numbers 25:9, before the crisis was stopped. And this is what Revelation 2:14 refers to when Jesus warns the church at Pergamum about those who hold to the teaching of Balaam. The pattern was not just about cursing. It was about using the back door of temptation when the front door of confrontation was closed. Balaam is eventually killed in the war against Midian, Numbers 31:8. Named among the dead without ceremony, a man who wielded words of extraordinary beauty in service of his own destruction. What does God want every generation to understand through all of this? The episode with the donkey is not a colorful detour in the Balaam narrative. It is the theological center of the entire account. Before Balaam could stand on any hilltop and open his mouth, God had already established, on a dusty road with a speaking animal and an angel holding a sword, that the outcome of this encounter was never in Balak's hands or Balaam's hands. The sovereignty of God over human speech, human plans, and human spiritual gifting had been demonstrated in the most humiliating possible way before a single oracle was delivered. Balak tried to purchase divine power with silver. Balaam tried to negotiate with God toward an outcome that served his own ambitions. And God answered both of them with a donkey. That is the theological statement. The most influential king in the region east of the Jordan and the most respected seer in Mesopotamia were both reduced to spectators by an animal on a road. God's power does not operate on the terms that human ambition imagines, and it cannot be redirected by money, prestige, or persistent petitioning. There is also a word here about the nature of spiritual gifting separated from spiritual integrity. Balaam was not a fraud. His oracles are among the most elevated poetry in the entire Pentateuch, and the Messianic declaration of Numbers 24:17 was taken seriously by generations of Jewish and Christian readers. He had genuine access to divine communication. He was the real thing. And that is exactly what makes his story a warning, rather than a simple cautionary tale about a wicked man. The danger the scripture is tracing is not the obvious false prophet who manufactures visions that never happened. The danger is the genuinely gifted person who slowly allows that gifting to serve their own hunger for money, recognition, and influence, who still delivers accurate words from God while quietly working on the side to produce the outcome their greed requires through other means. The donkey's speech was God's declaration that this kind of double life will eventually be exposed, not by thunderbolts but by the most ordinary and unlikely instrument. The creature you have ridden without thinking your entire life, suddenly refusing to move forward, suddenly speaking with a voice you cannot dismiss. The angel's question to Balaam echoes across every generation that has ever tried to silence a warning. Why have you beaten your donkey these 3 times? Why have you been striking the very thing that was standing between you and your death? How many times do people suppress the quiet resistance, punish the faithful friend who will not keep agreeing, beat down the internal check that keeps pressing against the wall of their ambition, never realizing that what is pushing back against them is not an obstacle but a mercy? The donkey was not Balaam's problem. The donkey was Balaam's salvation. She was the reason he was still breathing when the angel finally came into his sight. He had beaten her 3 times for saving his life 3 times, and when God opened his eyes and he saw the angel, Balaam did something worth pausing on. He did not flee. He did not construct an excuse. He fell on his face. Numbers 22:31. Whatever else may be said about Balaam, and the rest of the biblical record says a great deal, none of it favorable, in that moment on the road he did the one thing that was still available to him. He fell down. That posture before God is not nothing. It is where honesty begins. It is where the road could change. The tragedy of Balaam is not that he fell on his face before the angel. The tragedy is that when he rose, he kept looking for ways to serve 2 masters. God always has more to say to a person on their face than to a person on their way to collect wages for a curse. If this study reached you today, and something in it pressed against your heart, a question, a recognition, a quiet discomfort that feels like it may be important, leave a comment right now and tell me where you are listening from. Are you in Brazil, the United States, Portugal, Angola, Mozambique, Nigeria, the United Kingdom, or somewhere else in the world entirely? It means everything to know that these words are finding you wherever you are. And if this message mattered to you, share it with someone who needs to hear that God is still standing in the road with his sword drawn and his mercy intact, waiting to open our eyes before we walk past the place where the road runs out.